Here's a delicious paradox that would make the sophists of our age choke on their morning coffee. Christians become proud precisely because they practice humility, while those who preach self-assertion end up cowering before every fashionable opinion. The humbler a man becomes before God, the more magnificently defiant he grows toward the petty tyrannies of this world. It's rather like saying the deeper you bow, the taller you stand, which sounds contradictory until you realize that the deepest bow is before the highest throne. Today, we'll explore why this apparent contradiction reveals one of Christianity's most revolutionary truths, that real humility produces the most glorious kind of pride, while false pride produces the most degrading humility. The secret lies in understanding what, or rather whom, we bow before, and what mountains of nonsense we therefore refuse to worship. This paradox strikes at the heart of modern confusion about strength and weakness, independence and dependence, wisdom and folly. We live in an age that has forgotten the ancient truth that he who would be greatest must be servant of all, and consequently produces neither greatness nor service, but only the anxious mediocrity of those who know neither how to command nor how to obey. Chapter 1: The Democracy of the Dead. The modern world has confused humility with servility, and pride with courage, creating a civilization of intellectual cowards who mistake their timidity for tolerance. Watch any contemporary intellectual grovel before the latest academic fashion while simultaneously sneering at 2,000 years of Christian wisdom. He calls his groveling open-mindedness and his sneering critical thinking, but his performance reveals the opposite, a mind so closed to tradition that it swallows every novelty, and thinking so uncritical that it accepts current opinions simply because they are current. Yet which requires more courage, to challenge the trending hashtag of the moment, or to challenge the accumulated wisdom of saints and martyrs? The humble Christian, you see, practices democracy in its most radical form. He gives a vote to his ancestors. He refuses the intellectual arrogance of assuming that truth began with his generation, or the chronological snobbery of believing that newer necessarily means truer. This makes him humble before the vast parliament of the dead, yet magnificently proud when facing the tiny oligarchy of contemporary opinion. Consider the beautiful absurdity: the Christian who humbly accepts that Augustine knew something about human nature, Aquinas about reason, and Newman about conscience suddenly discovers he possesses intellectual weapons that make him formidable against modern error. He bows low to these giants, which is precisely why he can stand tall against the intellectual pygmies who demand his immediate submission to their diminutive theories. The depth of his historical humility becomes the source of his contemporary courage. This isn't mere conservatism, it's the most radical position imaginable. The humble Christian claims that truth exists independently of current opinion, that wisdom accumulates through generations, and that the dead have something to teach the living. These claims drive modern intellectuals to fury precisely because they threaten the fundamental pride of our age, the assumption that we are the first generation to think clearly about human existence. The Christian's humility toward tradition becomes pride in the highest sense, the pride of joining humanity's greatest conversation rather than starting his own small monologue. Chapter 2: The Mathematics of Morality. Here's where the paradox deepens delightfully. The Christian who considers himself the chief of sinners becomes the most formidable opponent of sin itself. The man who beats his breast in the confessional becomes the same man who fearlessly confronts corruption in the streets. This isn't contradiction, it's spiritual mathematics of the most precise kind. Pride and humility don't cancel each other out, they multiply each other when properly directed. The humble Christian sees sin clearly because he's an expert witness. He knows the territory intimately from personal exploration. When a man has honestly examined his own heart and found it deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, he develops what we might call moral X-ray vision. He can spot self-deception, rationalization, and spiritual pride at remarkable distances because he's practiced identifying them at close range. His confessions have been his graduate education in the anatomy of evil. But here's the mathematical beauty: the more clearly a person sees his own moral failures, the more precisely he can identify moral failure everywhere else, and the more courage he has to confront it. Pride blinds us to both categories of sin, our own and others. We either see no sin anywhere, the optimistic blindness, or we see sin only in others, the pharisaical blindness, or we see sin only in ourselves, the melancholic blindness. But humility before God provides perfect moral vision, like the correct prescription for spiritual astigmatism. The humble believer fights sin courageously because he's already surrendered the pride that would make him defensive about moral standards. When you've already admitted you're a sinner saved by grace, you're wonderfully free to call sin by its proper name without worrying about your reputation for righteousness. You've already publicly acknowledged your need for mercy, so you can afford to be merciless toward evil without being merciless toward evildoers. This creates the most effective moral reformers, people who hate sin precisely because they love sinners, including themselves. They possess both the humility to admit moral failure and the pride to demand moral excellence. The deeper the confession, the stronger the conviction. The more thoroughly a man has repented of his own pride, the more proudly he can defend humility against its cultured despisers. Chapter 3: The Adventure of Orthodoxy. Nothing is more thrilling than discovering you were right to trust common sense and Christian tradition, especially when the entire intellectual establishment insisted you were wrong. The humble believer who accepts orthodoxy finds himself on the greatest intellectual adventure possible, defending truths that work against theories that collapse, supporting systems that produce saints against philosophies that produce only skeptics. While the proud skeptic exhausts himself chasing every novel idea like a philosophical butterfly collector, the humble Christian enjoys the satisfaction of watching ancient wisdom vindicate itself in daily experience. Marriage works better than free love, not because Christians say so, but because married people are measurably happier, healthier, and more productive than their unmarried contemporaries. Forgiveness heals better than revenge, not because the Sermon on the Mount commands it, but because forgiveness actually repairs relationships while revenge only perpetuates cycles of destruction. Charity accomplishes more than activism, not because St. Paul recommended it, but because feeding actual hungry people produces better results than organizing committees to discuss hunger. The Christian who humbly accepts these traditional truths discovers he's backed the winning horses in life's great race. His humility toward revelation becomes intellectual pride of the best sort, not the pride that boasts and preens, but the pride that quietly knows and confidently acts. He's like a man who humbly followed his grandfather's map to buried treasure while the proud explorers who rejected the old paths are still wandering in circles, drawing new maps that lead nowhere. Orthodox humility produces the deepest satisfaction and the most justified confidence in one's fundamental life choices. When you discover that traditional Christian morality produces better marriages, stronger families, healthier communities, and more flourishing individuals than any alternative yet attempted, you develop what we might call empirical pride, pride based not on theory but on results, not on innovation but on verification. This adventure of orthodoxy transforms the humble believer into the most confident cultural critic imaginable. He doesn't need to invent new standards, he simply needs to apply old ones. He doesn't need to imagine better alternatives, he simply needs to point toward the alternatives that have already proven themselves. His humility before Christian tradition becomes magnificent pride in Christian achievement, not because Christianity is his idea, but because Christianity is God's idea that works. Chapter 4: The Courage of Dependence. Modern psychology has taught us that independence makes us strong, but Christianity teaches the opposite paradox. Complete dependence on God makes us magnificently independent of everything else that claims divine authority over human souls. The Christian who humbly admits his absolute need for divine grace discovers he no longer needs human approval, political fashion, cultural validation, or any of the thousand small tyrannies that keep his prouder neighbors in constant anxiety. When you depend completely on God, you become wonderfully independent of gods, those little idols of career advancement, social status, peer acceptance, and public reputation that terrorize modern life. The humble believer prays for daily bread, which frees him from the anxious pursuit of wealth that never satisfies. He confesses his sins regularly, which frees him from the exhausting pretense of perfection that exhausts everyone who attempts it. He accepts divine mercy as pure gift, which frees him from the crushing burden of earning his worth through performance, productivity, or public acclaim. This total dependence on heavenly grace produces the most liberating independence from earthly tyrannies. The man who kneels before God can stand before anyone else without trembling, because he has already received the only approval that ultimately matters. He can afford to lose arguments, elections, popularity contests, and even his reputation, because his fundamental identity rests secure in divine love rather than human opinion. Watch how this transforms daily life. The Christian employee who depends on God for security can afford to maintain integrity even when it threatens his advancement. The Christian citizen who depends on God for justice can afford to oppose popular injustices even when it costs him social standing. The Christian parent who depends on God for wisdom can afford to discipline his children even when it makes him temporarily unpopular in his own household. This dependence-produced independence creates the most formidable opponents of human tyranny. Totalitarian governments have always recognized that their greatest enemies are people who depend on someone higher than the state. You cannot threaten someone who has already surrendered everything to God. You cannot bribe someone who has already received treasure in heaven. You cannot intimidate someone who has already died to self and risen with Christ. The humble believer becomes beautifully indifferent to the opinions that terrorize his neighbors, not through proud disdain but through humble trust. His courage comes not from self-confidence but from God-confidence, which proves infinitely more reliable because it doesn't depend on his own fluctuating strength but on divine constancy. Chapter 5: The Democracy of Doctrine. Pride makes us slaves to novelty, while humility makes us free to enjoy truth wherever we find it, regardless of its age, popularity, or intellectual fashionability. The proud intellectual must constantly prove his originality by rejecting yesterday's wisdom and embracing tomorrow's fad. He's like a fashion victim, but for ideas, always anxiously checking whether his thoughts are sufficiently current, sufficiently cutting edge, sufficiently different from what previous generations believed. This creates the most exhausting form of intellectual servitude imaginable. The proud thinker can never simply agree with Paul, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Newman, or Chesterton himself without first demonstrating that his agreement is somehow novel, sophisticated, or critically revised. He must always add his own improvements to ancient wisdom, like a man who insists on repainting every masterpiece he encounters to prove he's not merely copying. The humble Christian, by contrast, feels perfectly free to agree with great minds of the past without worrying whether such agreement demonstrates insufficient creativity or intellectual independence. He practices intellectual democracy in its purest form, giving equal weight to good ideas regardless of their vintage, their popularity, or their compatibility with current academic fashion. This makes him simultaneously the most traditional and most liberated thinker possible. Consider the beautiful freedom this produces. When Aquinas brilliantly explains how reason and faith complement each other, the humble Christian simply says, "Yes, exactly," without feeling compelled to invent a new theory of epistemology. When Newman eloquently describes the development of doctrine, the humble believer gratefully accepts the insight without needing to prove he could have thought of it himself. When Augustine powerfully analyzes the human heart's restlessness, the humble reader responds with recognition rather than rivalry. This humility toward Christian doctrine produces intellectual pride of the finest quality, the pride of a man who knows he's in magnificent company. While the proud innovator exhausts himself trying to be clever, the humble believer enjoys being wise. While the academic struggles to say something that has never been said before, the Christian delights in saying something that has always been true. The humble believer discovers that intellectual humility actually enhances rather than diminishes intellectual joy. When you're not competing with Augustine, you can simply enjoy Augustine. When you're not trying to surpass Aquinas, you can learn from Aquinas. When you're not attempting to improve on Scripture, you can be transformed by Scripture. This freedom from intellectual pride produces the deepest intellectual satisfaction, the satisfaction of participating in humanity's greatest conversation rather than desperately trying to dominate it. Chapter 6: The Strength of Submission. Watch how this works in the practical laboratory of daily life. The Christian husband who humbly submits to his wedding vows becomes magnificently proud of his marriage, while the proud bachelor who submits to no one becomes pathetically dependent on every passing attraction, every flattering glance, every possibility of something better around the next corner. The humble believer who submits to church authority develops strong convictions that enable him to resist cultural pressure, while the proud individualist who submits to no doctrine becomes a pushover for every fashionable opinion, precisely because he has no fixed principles from which to evaluate new ideas. This pattern reveals itself everywhere once you begin looking. Submission to higher authority actually produces strength of character, while refusal of all authority produces weakness of will. The soldier who submits to military discipline becomes formidable in battle. The civilian who submits to no discipline becomes helpless in crisis. The musician who submits to the rules of harmony creates beautiful music. The rebel who rejects all musical structure produces only noise. The athlete who submits to rigorous training achieves peak performance. The amateur who trains only when he feels like it remains mediocre forever. Christianity reveals this pattern operating in the spiritual and moral realm. Humble submission to divine authority produces magnificent strength against human tyranny. The Christian who bows before the cross stands tall before the world. His submission to God's will makes him wonderfully resistant to man's manipulation, not because he's proud of his own strength, but because he draws strength from an inexhaustible source. Consider how this transforms the believer's relationship with human authorities. Because he serves the highest king, he can serve earthly rulers without worshiping them. Because he obeys the ultimate law, he can challenge unjust laws without becoming lawless. Because he submits to perfect love, he can resist human hatred without becoming hateful. His spiritual obedience produces moral independence of the most reliable kind. The deeper his submission to divine authority, the stronger his resistance to every false authority that demands ultimate allegiance. You cannot successfully threaten someone who has already surrendered everything to God. You cannot successfully bribe someone who treasures heavenly rewards above earthly ones. You cannot successfully intimidate someone whose ultimate security rests in divine hands rather than human institutions. This creates the most paradoxical and powerful form of strength: strength through surrender, resistance through submission, independence through dependence. The humble Christian becomes simultaneously the most obedient and most rebellious person in any society: obedient to God, rebellious against everything that usurps God's place. His submission makes him magnificently free to oppose every tyranny except the one tyranny that liberates, the sweet yoke of Christ that makes all other yokes seem unbearably heavy by comparison. Chapter 7: The Glory of Gratitude. Finally, here's the most beautiful part of this divine paradox. Christian humility produces the deepest and most unshakable pride because it's rooted in gratitude rather than achievement, in divine love rather than human performance, in grace received rather than success earned. The proud man's pride depends entirely on his own accomplishments, which makes it fragile, anxious, and exhausting to maintain. He must constantly prove himself, defend his reputation, and fear any failure that might damage his carefully constructed self-image. The humble Christian's pride depends on God's grace, which makes it unshakable and joyful. When you know you're loved not because you're perfect but because you're chosen, not because you've earned it but because it's been freely given, You develop a quiet confidence that no failure can destroy and no success can inflate beyond healthy proportions. This is pride with the proper foundation, not your own rickety achievements that might collapse at any moment, but God's unshakable love that endures forever. This gratitude-based pride transforms the believer's entire relationship with success and failure, praise and criticism, prosperity and adversity. When good things happen, he responds with thanksgiving rather than self-congratulation. When bad things happen, he responds with trust rather than despair. When people praise him, he can receive it gracefully without becoming vain. When people criticize him, he can consider it seriously without becoming defensive. His fundamental worth doesn't fluctuate with circumstances because it rests on divine love rather than worldly evaluation. Watch how this produces the most attractive kind of confidence. The humble Christian walks through life with the quiet pride of a beloved child, not arrogant about his own merits, but confident in his infinite worth to the one who matters most. He doesn't need to prove himself because he's already been chosen. He doesn't need to defend himself because he's already been justified. He doesn't need to promote himself because he's already been adopted into the ultimate family. This is why humble Christians often seem more joyfully self-assured than proud atheists. Their pride has better foundations, more reliable sources, and clearer reasons. The atheist's pride depends on maintaining the illusion that he's the product of his own efforts, while the Christian's pride rests on the solid rock of divine grace. The atheist must constantly worry about losing what he's earned. The Christian can rest secure in what he's been given. This gratitude-produced pride creates the most generous and attractive personalities, people who are confident enough to be humble, secure enough to be vulnerable, and loved enough to love others without fear or calculation. They possess both the humility to admit their failures and the pride to celebrate their divine adoption. Their gratitude makes them proud in the best sense, proud to belong to God, proud to bear His image, proud to serve His purposes. Conclusion. So there you have it, the magnificent paradox that drives our age to distraction and reveals Christianity's revolutionary wisdom about human nature. Christians become proud through humility, strong through submission, free through dependence, wise through accepting ancient truth, and confident through practicing gratitude. Every apparent contradiction reveals a deeper harmony. Every seeming weakness produces unexpected strength. Every supposed disadvantage becomes a glorious advantage. The Christian who bows lowest stands tallest, serves most freely, thinks most independently, and lives most confidently. His humility toward God becomes his glory before men. His submission to truth becomes his liberation from error. His dependence on grace becomes his independence from anxiety, and his gratitude for divine love becomes his confidence in eternal worth. This is not contradiction but completion, the beautiful resolution of human nature's deepest tensions through divine love. May you discover the joy of this divine paradox for yourself, that the deepest humility produces the most magnificent pride, that together they produce the most wonderful life imaginable, and that both point toward the ultimate reality, a God so great that submission to Him is perfect freedom, so loving that dependence on Him is ultimate security, and so wise that trusting Him is the beginning of all true knowledge.